Welcome back for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast, brought to you by the generosity of the William Wood Foundation. I'm Eric Mills, the editor-in-chief of Naval History Magazine, and today we're going to go back 80 years to when the Battle of the Atlantic was still raging in 1943. Now, there are a lot of vivid images that come from this in terms of accounts, firsthand accounts. There was some rough seas in more ways than one, folks, but the images we have to look at today come courtesy of an artist who also served. Like so many professions during that war, everybody from bricklayers to baseball players and everyone in between rallied to the cause. And that included the artists of the world as well. And we're fortunate for history that the artist who was in the Battle of the Atlantic is the artist laureate of the Coast Guard. And he was a brilliant artist, actually, of that Howard Pyle School, NCY School, early 20th century, beautiful book illustration, one of my favorite genres of art. So naturally, I'm thrilled to see that sort of artistry applied to his important event as the Battle of the Atlantic. And here to tell us all about this and this amazing artist who saw combat at the same time he was capturing the images around him is the Atlantic Area Historian for the U.S. Coast Guard, William Thiessen. Bill, welcome aboard. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Eric. Good to be with you.
So the Coast Guard landed quite a good artist laureate in World War II. Why don't you tell us a little about whom we're talking about here?
So Anton Otto Fischer was orphaned at a young age from Germany, and he decided to start a life on the ocean, and because his stepfather originally was a ship captain, he decided to start out a life on the sea and did coastal and local sailing in the European area. But then he went to the high seas, sailed over the Atlantic, sailed up the Pacific coast of the U.S., and so he did quite a bit of high sea sailing as well. And that was the inspiration for him becoming an artist later in life. So he studied with some of the noted artists in New York City before going to Paris to actually study art on his own painting, and then returned to the U.S. to become a student of Howard Pyle and to learn that style of illustration, which he used and was quite popular for book illustration, periodicals, magazines throughout the early 20th century in the U.S.
Yeah, his work graces the pages of many a classic book. We're talking before we went on here about illustrated works by Jack London, various others as well. I've always been a fan of this school of art, and so to me, this really resonates. I mean, we look at a lot of good nautical art here at the Institute and in the magazine, and every now and then someone comes along who takes it to another level of the movement, the light, the capturing of the waves, the expressions on the faces of the people. This all very visibly brings to life the Battle of the Atlantic in almost a more timeless way than a photograph can. And I think it's interesting you point out that the sea was at the very beginning of his pursuit of art. It's not like he was an artist who found this niche. The sea was in his blood, and then he became an artist. And that's why he captures it so well. But why don't you tell us about his journey from successful illustrator / artist to his service in World War II?
Well, I think a lot of people today don't realize that prior to World War II, illustrations were sometimes the finest color representations of subject matter in American publications, magazines in particular, such as the Saturday Evening Post. And so a lot of artists made a very good living becoming illustrators for various publications in the U.S., including books. And so Anton Otto Fischer became noted primarily for his maritime subject matter, although he illustrated a variety of different subjects for these publications. And so he was well known by the time World War II came along. And the Coast Guard actually decided under the Commandant, Russell Waesche, that they were interested in trying to illustrate wartime scenes from the Coast Guard. And so as a result, they did a rather large campaign, not only to recruit artists to illustrate and represent what frontline action looked like, but they also recruited a considerable number of photojournalists from the newspaper field. And some of those went on to photograph some of the iconic images that you see from World War II from the naval and maritime side, especially D-Day and some of the amphibious operations in the Pacific. However, Anton Otto Fischer was well known by Russell Waesche prior to his visit to the Coast Guard headquarters in 1943. The commandant invited him to come and dine with him at headquarters, have lunch, and so they talked. And the same day that Waesche and Fischer had lunch, that afternoon, Fischer was commissioned a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard Reserve to be a combat artist for the service. And within a month or 6 weeks, he was already given orders to deploy on board one of the Coast Guard's convoy escorts, a cutter by the name of Campbell, which is where you see a lot of these renderings and paintings originated from.
Now, the Campbell gets into quite a tangle in your narrative. By the way, folks, you can read all about this in Naval History Online. The article is called Eyewitness to the Battle of the Atlantic. And as you can imagine, it's profusely illustrated with some very colorful imagery, as well as quite a sea story as well. It's not just an art gallery. The Campbell gets into quite a fracas with the U-606, I believe it is. Why don't we tell about that?
So Fischer actually deployed on the convoy outbound from the East Coast to the UK, and didn't encounter too much trouble on that leg of the trip. But on the return trip, outbound from the UK to the East Coast, they encountered a really large wolf pack just a few days out from ports in the UK. And as a result, the Campbell was tangling with up to 6 different U-boats in its attempt to protect the convoy. And it was convoy ON 166, meaning outbound to North America 166. At the same time, they were not only battling the enemy, but the Campbell, and with Fischer on board, was also battling the elements. There was a really bad gale storm that was taking place while they were underway, scattered a lot of the ships from the convoy. And so when the Campbell first started its escort, it encountered a U-boat while it was trying to get the crew off of a tanker. This was the 20th of February, 1943. Damaged the U-boat, got the crew off, and then proceeded at flank speed to join the rest of the convoy. It battled a number of U-boats on the way to getting back to the main body of the ships. And when it arrived there, another U-boat, U-606, had already sunk 2 ships in the convoy, damaged another, and it had actually incurred its own damage at the same time. It had to surface due to the damage it had received from depth charges. And so this battle took place on the surface between the Campbell and the U-606 in the very early hours of February 21st in the dark.
Can you imagine? They correct me if they ram the U-boat, do they not?
That's correct. The entire time this was taking place, Fischer was on board and sketching a lot of these scenes the best he could under combat conditions. So a lot of this was eyewitness imagery that was later painted in color. The U-606 was attacking with his deck gun and trying to sink more merchant ships. Campbell went to flank speed to ram, and as a result, it did a glancing blow on the U-boat, and as a result, the planes that were in that steer the boat in vertical sea element actually gouged a hole in the engine room spaces of Campbell, so water began to flow inside the ship while it was battling this U-boat. All guns were brought to bear. Searchlights were flipped on, and as a result, the main guns, primarily in the stern of the cutter, were brought to bear on the U-boat. I think the aft gun poured about 30 rounds into the conning tower and the fuselage of U-606, and was devastating fire that decimated the crew that was on deck trying to fight back with the submarine's deck gun.
That's quite a lot to be going on while you're also sketching illustrations of the action. It boggles the mind. I mean, just to be there in the thick of it, regardless of that, and then you add that extra layer of creativity on top of it. There's a certain extra courage to that, in a way, that speaks well of the spirit of the artist, I think.
Fischer was an old salt. When they were going steaming through the storm and the gale, he was actually enjoying himself, and a lot of members, his shipmates on board the Campbell, were actually seasick and incapacitated by the weather conditions. So he was probably one of the best choices to be a combat artist for the Coast Guard, because he was actually adept at interpreting and recording this combat action while it was underway. And it was truly probably one of the most dramatic combat events in escorts that the Coast Guard had during World War II.
That's pleasantly ironic in a way. It kind of flips the conventional narrative you would predict, where you got the old salts, the grizzled salts on there, sea weathered and seaworthy, and then among them is this artist who's been assigned to chronicle the events, and you'd think, oh, here's the effete artist, taken from his loft and comfort in the city, and he's out here in the bounding main with us. Yeah, he himself is the saltier one. He knows what it is to be on choppy seas. So
it's rather ironic too, because he was born and raised. His early life was Germany, and he actually spoke with a very heavy German accent. And when Weishi decided he wanted to make Fischer a combat artist for the Coast Guard Intelligence Office had some misgivings about bringing aboard an escort, just because they thought that he might be a security risk. But Weishi overruled that and had him deploy with the Campbell anyway. So it must have been pretty interesting when the Campbell finally prevailed and the U-boat gave up. Commander ordered abandoned ship. There were only 5 members of U-606's crew that survived at that point in the duel between the cutter and the U-boat. And they were brought on board the cutter, and here was Anton Fischer, who was German, I'm sure speaking fluent German to these POWs that had just been brought on board. It might have been shocking to them, I'm not sure. But it was an interesting and ironic situation.
They probably weren't expecting that. They bored, vanquished and defeated, but rescued, and here's somebody speaking their native language. I can understand why they'd be a little leery of that in the time of war, but you don't get any sense that he came here, and he didn't ever go back to Germany or anything. I think he became like very much an American, once he got here, like so many people did at that time.
Yeah, he was a huge New York Yankees fan.
That's right. It
He
was Yankees,
yeah,
cigars, and poker, right?
yeah, he embraced the American lifestyle, and his home was near Woodstock, and it was kind of a community of artists at that time, as it would become later on for musicians, for example. So he really was one of the original creative people that inhabited that space, and that's where his studio, where he moved his studio to as well, to Kingston. And so all of the sketches that he produced during the convoy escort duty, he went back to his studio and was still on orders when he was painting in his studio as a reserve lieutenant commander. And then these paintings later became part of the Coast Guard collection. But like I said, Weishi and actually public affairs division of the Coast Guard at that time thought that combat artists, photojournalists were some of the best people to have on board for recruiting, as well as for propaganda such as posters and for war drive imagery and illustrations. And in fact, it's true because you can see in this collection of images, and we actually have quite a few more in the Coast Guard collection, that um, these are very rich and detailed color representations of what it was like to be in this sort of combat action. And if you look at the imagery from World War II, virtually all of it is black and white photographs. So, except when you get to the end of the war, when you do see some color films, maybe some color photographs, but up until the latter part of the war, it was primarily black and white. So this is a really rare piece of art history because it's somebody who was an eyewitness to one of the most dramatic escort duties in World War II combat. He was right there during a gun duel between a U-boat and a Coast Guard cutter, and the U-boat was sunk, and the cutter almost sank as well. It lost all of its power when its engine space is flooded, and Fisher and the rest of the people on board, the 50 crew members from the tanker that were rescued, the 5 German POWs, and any non-essential crew all had to be evacuated to other ships because they were unsure that the Campbell would survive. It was dead in the water for 4 days before it was finally towed away to Canada. But meantime, there was a skeleton crew trying to save the vessel before it filled with water and sank, which fortunately they did.
That's just it. I mean, it's one thing to have a combat artist on board, but to have a combat artist on board when a particularly actionful amount of combat occurs, and it's like you can't plan that, and
Mm-hmm.
it makes you. It kind of begs the question. There's so many other moments like that in this cataclysmic war that didn't have the combat artist right there, and think of how much more vivid a picture we'd have of what we know it from the records and whatnot. We have a vivid picture, but not a visual, striking picture of it. And what you just said really resonates for me because that's especially true. The black and whiteness, the monochrome quality of the images of World War II. That to me most fully applies to something like the Battle of the Atlantic. I think of all the images of these gray, dismal, bleak, choppy seas, these gray vessels pounding through there. And it's the most black and white theater of the war I can think of. And to see it captured with such vivid color, I mean, it really does remind one of the sort of heroic style, classic story illustrations that he did for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And the classic novels he illustrated and the magazine covers he did. It's a rich period of art, and then to have that implanted on this very crucial part of the war, you're right. It's a treasure trove, and it makes you wish there were more of those. Did they deploy him elsewhere in the war? I mean, is this the main work we got from him of sort of historical value from the conflict? Because
This was,
I know he's a
yeah,
prolific artist otherwise.
he was prolific, and this collection is the main work that he did. There are other pieces in the Coast Guard collection that I didn't select just because they weren't a part of this convoy escort duty. However, he did do, I would say, another dozen or more paintings of life at sea with the Coast Guard that are not necessarily associated with convoy duty. But I would say that he was ended his reserve career. He started in 43 and he was decommissioned in 1945. So he spent much of the 2 years that he was a member of the reserves painting these images in his studio up in Kingston.
Mm-hmm.
But this, I'm sure, was probably one of the highlights. In fact, it probably was the highlight of his career as an artist, to be actually deployed on a combat vessel during combat action, because that, like I said before, was his specialty, was maritime naval art. So it was really a chance to use his skill sets to the best of his ability. And I suspect he probably got a certain amount of excitement and reward out of doing this duty for the Coast Guard.
Yeah, in fact, now that you mention it that way, this makes sense that this could have been the very apotheosis of his artistic career, because it melded the two worlds that he occupied, the seafaring and the painting, in a very eventful moment on the sea and in history. Well, he continued to paint after the war. I mean, he lives all the way to like into the early 1960s, correct? And
Correct. Mm-hmm.
He continued to be prolific. This has made me interested to look up more of his art and find out more about him. I believe was his wife an artist as well?
So his wife was an artist. She was also the daughter of the skipper of the USS Maine, which was, of course, sunk in Havana Harbor in Cuba. Last name was Sigsbee.
Oh, sure.
He had a naval background with his wife. She was, of course, as I said before, an artist as well. They had one daughter, and I don't believe she ever married. All three are buried in Kingston, New York, at the same cemetery there.
Have you seen Mary Ellen Sigsbee Fisher? Have you seen any of her art? Is it a similar school of art or different kind of approach?
It's a similar school of art because they met when they were both students at Howard Pyle.
Right.
So that's when they met and they married.
Mm-hmm.
So it's similar. I don't believe she was as well known in her artwork, and I'm not even familiar with. I suspect she did illustrations for periodicals and publications just like he did, but I'm not familiar with which ones that she illustrated for.
I'm sure the biggie for all that school of arts was to get a Saturday Evening Post cover. I mean, that's going to be the most wide dissemination of your work in America at that point in time. Everybody got the Saturday Evening Post, and everybody loved those covers.
Mm-hmm.
I know they're highly collectible to this day.
Sure, that was one of his primary publications. But if you go through some of the other combat artists that the Coast Guard has had during World War II, most of them worked in pencil and paper or pastels, black and white, and others that did work in color did not witness the sort of combat action that Fischer witnessed. I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Jacob Lawrence, later became a famed modernist painter, but he was the combat artist on board the Sea Cloud. His work is color as well, but they never experienced any combat, so he didn't paint any of that. And some of those paintings are quite famous and are in our collection as well.
While we're talking, the Naval Institute Press years ago did a book. It's kind of a classic, The Coast Guard of World War II. Mm-hmm. Big volume, sort of a definitive work, and there's a beautiful painting from a Coast Guard combat artist on the cover of that book. And I'm going to go find a copy of it after we talk here, because now
I think there's one behind you on your shelf, isn't there?
Is it really?
Yeah, up on the top shelf.
Okay.
Coast Guard in World War II by Willoughby.
Which way?
Up above, the top shelf, over the other shoulder. It's up on
okay,
top.
folks, we're going to do something very unconventional here for the Naval History Podcast. I'm going to get up from my MC's chair here. History's being made as we speak.
That's right. Isn't that Coast Guard World War II on the top shelf?
Ah! All right, everybody out there in podcast land is thinking this was staged between Bill and me, but it was not. That was an unscripted, unplanned event. It was serendipity and meant to be that this was behind me. But yeah, see, look at this. That's a pretty neat shot right there. Let me see if I can get this on here. Oh, it's all glary. You can't see it, but it's a great shot. You know, storming a beach, guns blazing.
Yeah, it's Douglas Monroe, the Medal of Honor recipient at Guadalcanal.
Okay, yes. Signalman First Class Douglas Monroe, USCG, Possum Award, Congressional Medal of Honor. Evacuating Marines at Guadalcanal, September 42. Painting by Bernard D'Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
Bernard D'Andrea.
Yep.
More great combat art.
There you go.
And I highly recommend this book.
Yeah, it's pretty
Find
cool.
a copy of it. Bill already has it. I'm talking to the people.
I've got several copies. That's why I recognize the dust cover.
That's a great picture too. Well, I'm trying to think what else we could talk about with this because it's such a fascinating topic. Do we know much more about him besides, you know, his seafaring and his art? I mean, oh, yes, we do. I mean, I like the fact that he was so thoroughly Americanized.
Mm-hmm.
The Yankees fan business, the cigars, the poker. It's hard not to want to know what this. Wish you'd known this guy. You know, he's sort of an all-rounder.
He was really quite a character. In addition to what you've mentioned already, he was a really proficient piano player. I have images of him playing the piano at home. So he was quite musical. He was just a all-around creative personality. But he also was a big believer in homegrown food. And so he and his wife, one of their biggest pastimes was tending the garden at home in their place there near Kingston in New York State. So just had a very interesting lifestyle as well as a career that was spanned several decades and was interesting as well.
So he was an artist, which in itself is inherently somewhat bohemian. He was a musician. He liked to grow his own food. He lived in Woodstock, New York, and he died in 1962. You have to wonder if he'd lasted for another 8 years or so, what he would have thought of what transpired there. But 7 years later,
yeah,
you have to wonder.
Maybe he would have enjoyed it. I don't know.
He could have been the elder statesman of what was going on.
That's right.
Well, Bill, it's a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to have you in naval history. And
Sure.
Make sure you check out this article, folks. It's online. It's Eyewitness to the Battle of the Atlantic. It just published, and it's timed. The events it describes happened literally 80 years ago, plus a week. So it's a very timely time to rediscover this artist and the event that he lived through. And we will be having more things from Bill as the year goes on in the magazines. So stay tuned. I look forward to that as well. Thank you for joining us, Bill. It's been a pleasure. And
always a pleasure, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for sharing this beautiful art and this wonderful sea story with us. Sure. I guess that's it for today, folks. I thank you again for joining us for the Naval History Podcast. And until next time, I'm Eric Mills signing off. Best of luck to you and take care.